Jung Psychology and Tibetan Buddhism, Western and Eastern Paths to the Heart, by Buddhism Moacanin. Preface. This book had its origin in Europe, when some years ago the Tibetan Buddhist master Lama Thaben Yeshwe flew west from Asia to give teachings, and I flew east from America to receive them. One day in a private interview with him, knowing of my interest in Jung, Inexplicably, he asked me to give a talk on Jung's psychology and its relation to Tibetan Buddhism. I protested. I was totally unprepared and knew so little about it. But Lama gently insisted. Frightened, I kept pleading with him to be excused from such an impossible task. But he was relentless and would not hear of it. For the first and only time that I had known Lama Yeshe, I truly believed we had failed to communicate. Little did I know what was to follow. Later that same day I quietly sat cross-legged on the floor of the meditation room in front of a large audience of Lama Yeshe's students and proceeded to deliver the talk. It turned out to be a memorable and a major event in my life. From then on I was gripped by the urge to learn and experience more of the two traditions. I began traveling on the exciting journey east and west, west and east, and in my mind each of the two disciplines supplemented, helped, explained further, and enriched each other. As a result, a few years later this book was produced. Synchronistically, just as it came into being in California, Lama Yeshwe, after a long absence, arrived there. I showed him the work, and he immediately encouraged me to have it published. Once again I was reluctant, but once again it was a task which I could not be excused. The book attempts to draw a parallel and discuss similarities and differences between Tibetan Buddhism and Jung psychology. The purpose is to identify possible connections so as to make a bridge between some aspects of Eastern and Western psychology and spiritual traditions, psychological and ethical systems. One of the main problems which I should like to investigate is the following. Since the two traditions have developed at different historical times, under vastly different sociocultural conditions and geographically at two opposite sides of the world, are they intrinsically so different and of psychological and ethical value only to the people where each was developed? Or is it possible to reconcile the two traditions, bring the twain together, allow a cross-fertilization, cross-synthesize, and adapt the findings, methods, and wisdoms of the one respective systems to the needs and conditions of the contemporary society, regardless of geographical boundaries? Other related questions which I shall put forward for investigation are as follows. Are there possible dangers inherent in allowing the Westerner to experiment with long-established and deeply rooted Eastern traditions? Are those dangers due basically to transplantation of spiritual discipline from one culture to another, from East to West, in the way the reverse occurred when Western industrial technology was introduced in so-called underdeveloped countries of the East, causing disruption of traditional patterns of living and working, and consequently often serious damage to the psychological equilibrium of the individuals concerned? Or are the dangers even more fundamental, like those the alchemists knew and warned us about, that their opus was, quote, like a death-dealing poison, unquote, meaning not only hazards of chemical poisoning, but also of mental aberrations? What are the precautions and safeguards, if any, in approaching the studies and practices of any Eastern spiritual tradition, which have to be kept secret for centuries, and has only very recently been revealed to the Western world? C.G. Jung, the alchemists, and Tibetan Buddhists have all been in search of the same truth, self, philosopher's stone, enlightenment? Or have they? Have their works a common core which, if properly understood and practiced, contain a universal value? Is there a meaningful coincidence in the 18th century prophecy that, quote, when the iron birds will fly, the Tibetans will leave their home, unquote, the prophecy being fulfilled in the very 20th century, which brought C.G. Jung to us? Many Tibetans have found a new home in Switzerland, one of the most congenial places for them outside of Tibet, looking at the same Alps which inspired Jung, and which are reminiscent of their own Himalayas, the surroundings and visions where the mind can best meditate and expand. Some years back, under the impact of the very same force that made the Tibetans leave their home, I too had to leave mine and found temporarily a new home in Switzerland. It was there that my first interest in Eastern mystical traditions was born. It was in Switzerland that I had my first encounter with the Dalai Lama. Ever since I met Tibetans, I have often felt gratitude in a strange way to that evil force, which was directly instrumental in bringing us together. For me, this represented a striking example of the possibility of experiencing that through transformation, which the Tibetans teach, and a demonstration of the multi-dimensional aspects of every event. I came into contact both with the works of Jung and with Tibetan Buddhism very spontaneously, and in each case as a result of a series of synchronistic events. Both systems had an immediate and strong impact on me, and I had an intimation that somehow they must be related to in a profoundly significant way, despite the fact that they were rooted in very different traditions and developed under very different outward circumstances. In this book I shall try to encompass general areas of Jung psychology and Tibetan Buddhism. These are subject matters of immense scope and complexity, both in theory and practice, and voluminous works have been produced in each areas. Therefore, my study shall be limited to certain issues only dealt with by Jung and the relation of alchemy to his own findings. The discussion of Buddhism will focus on Tantric Buddhism and its relation to Jung psychology. I can hardly discuss Tantric Buddhism, however, without placing it in the broader context of Tibetan Buddhism in general. This is the rationale for giving a brief overview of Tibetan Buddhism. The rationale for discussing Tantric Buddhism and its relation to Jung's psychology is based on my impression that this particular form of Buddhism is most directly concerned with the issues and problems that preoccupied Jung throughout his life, above all, the process of growth of consciousness and spiritual transformation. Jung refers to it as the tremendous experiment of becoming conscious, which nature has laid upon mankind, and which unites the most diverse cultures in a common task. Unquote. Despite its intricate complexity and esoteric nature, Tibetan Buddhism is essentially a psychological and ethical system. And unlike other philosophical theories and spiritual practices that have come to us from Asia, Tantric Buddhism is very much a living process, bridging the gap between our deepest yearnings for symbolic and spiritual mystery and the demands of our mundane life, always stressing that the meaning of life is in living it. I hope to arrive at some solutions to a few fundamental issues examined, and that the results will demonstrate and point to the interconnections between the two systems. I hope to be able to show that it is possible to reconcile an ancient Eastern spiritual discipline with a contemporary Western psychological system in a fruitful and meaningful way. Okay, before we start the reading inside the front cover, about Radmila Moacanin, was born in Belgrade, Yugoslavia. She studied in Geneva, New York, and Los Angeles, and earned a diploma in languages, an MA in United Nations and World Affairs, and another master's degree in social service, and received her PhD in psychology. She was a recipient of a Fulbright Fellowship to Italy. Dr. Moacanin had worked as a psychotherapist at the University of Southern California Medical Center. At present, she is engaged in private practice in Los Angeles. This book was published a while ago, and serves as a consultant in the National Intensive Journal program. She has traveled extensively throughout the world and speaks 6 languages. In the past 2 decades, the author has been a student of Zen and later Tibetan Buddhism. Chapter 1, Buddhism. Once upon a time, in a far-off land, there was a prince who had a beautiful wife and a young son. He was called Siddhartha Gautama. He had lived all his life in a big palace, and according to his father's wishes, never left the palace. His father, the king, was determined to protect his son and heir from seeing any misery, and to offer him all the worldly pleasures of life. Indeed, Siddhartha tasted to the full all the worldly pleasures of life. But one day he disobeyed his father's strict orders never to leave the palace grounds. With his devoted companion and charioteer Channa, he passed beyond the gate and ventured into the world. He came across an old man, a sick man, and a dead man, 3 sights totally unknown to the young prince. He asked Jhana whether he ever saw anything like that, and Jhana answered that old age, sickness, and death must come to all of us. For the first time in his life, Siddhartha was wounded by the arrow of a new awareness, that suffering of all humanity from which there is no escape. Finally, the fourth and decisive sight Siddhartha encountered was that of a wandering holy man. He no longer had a choice. The inner urgency, his newly discovered calling, was overwhelming, and he, too, had to leave his home, his royal life, and everything he cherished, including his parents, his beautiful wife, and small son. Silently, he left the royal palace for good, to embark alone on a long journey in pursuit of answers to the riddle of life. In his wanderings he met many famous, learned teachers, philosophers. He studied with them and followed their methods, but none of the learned men could answer his own questions, for there were no ordinary questions, not formulated in his head, but felt deeply in his heart, searching not for philosophical or metaphysical speculations, but the living truth. So, Siddhartha continued his solitary journey, searching for his treasure, the only treasure he so desperately wanted, and for which he was determined once more to sacrifice everything. For many years he lived in the forest as a hermit, endeavoring to gain control over his body and mind. He was successful in his efforts, but the results were a starved, extremely weakened body and a discouraged mind, while the treasure he was seeking still eluded him. The depth of hopelessness, Siddhartha realized that his body was his most precious instrument, not to be abused through aesthetic practices any more than through sense indulgences, both of which he had known so well. It was through his human body, and through it alone, that he could reach the treasure hard to find. Now it was time for the former prince and the former ascetic to again change his life, to abandon the way of self-denial and enter a more balanced path, the middle path. So he took a meal, bathed, put on fresh clothes. Siddhartha then sat cross-legged under a tree to meditate and vowed not to remove himself from the spot until he found the treasure. And indeed, after many days of sitting under the tree, the treasure came to him in a flash of illumination. He attained enlightenment, the living truth he had been searching for. At that moment, Siddhartha became the Buddha, the awakened one. He lived a long life, bringing the treasure he discovered to many people, young and old, rich and poor, learned and uneducated, to everyone and anyone who was ready to discover the treasure for himself. For the treasure was to be found nowhere else but within the depths of each individual mind. His mortal body died at the age of 80 or so, but Prince Siddhartha Gautama, the Buddha, lived happily ever after in the minds and hearts of millions of human beings who accepted his message and made it a living reality. This is the tale of Sakyamuni Buddha, probably one of the oldest and most repeated and the most fantastic of all tales. It has been told and has inspired countless human beings for 2.5 millennia. What was the message that Sakyamuni Buddha brought to the world? Above all, that each human being has the potential to attain enlightenment and become a Buddha. Man is his own master, and there is no higher being or power than sits in judgment over his destiny. Buddha and his followers to this day can only teach, guide, point the path to liberation. Each person must enter and walk the path alone, just as Siddhartha did. One must maintain a healthy doubt about the teachings one receives, no matter who the authority, including the Buddha, until their validity is clearly confirmed through investigation, analysis, and experience. Only when we have discovered that the teachings are valuable and applicable to our own life should we follow them. Ultimately, we are our own authority in the spiritual quest. There is no revealed truth, sacred scripture, dogma, and no savior. The essence of Buddha's teaching and the foundation of all subsequent Buddhist doctrine was expressed in his first sermon delivered at Sarnath near Benares after his enlightenment on the night of the full moon of July. In it he expounded the four noble truths. 1. Ubiquitous existence of suffering in life. 2. The source of suffering is to be found in selfish craving and attachment of all kinds. 3. Cessation, liberation, freedom from suffering is possible. 4. The path leading from suffering to liberation. The Four Noble Truths doctrine further elaborate on this path, generally referred to as the middle way, because it is free from all extremes. It is also called the Noble Eightfold Path, in that it specifies rules of behavior in thought and speech and action that lead to liberation. They are 1. Right understanding. Speakers or readers comment. Better said, I think, wise understanding, but we'll just read here. Uh, right thought, purpose or aspiration, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, awareness, attentiveness, right concentration or meditation. These 8 categories constitute the foundation of Buddhist training, which, when properly applied and followed, lead to a balanced and harmonious life, benefiting both individual and society. The first 2 categories, right understanding and right thought, have to do with development of wisdom. The next 3, right speech, right action, right livelihood, are ethical conduct, and the last 2, right mindfulness and right concentration, with mental discipline. Wisdom, ethical conduct, and mental discipline are interrelated and are to be pursued simultaneously, each promoting the development of the other. Thus, the philosophical, ethical, and psychological components together constitute the foundation for spiritual development. From this simple yet profound exposition of the Four Noble Truths, the Noble Eightfold Path pronounced by Sakyamuni Buddha in the subsequent centuries, a staggering amount of interpretations through oral commentaries and written material evolved, often contradictory and conflicting. Some are dealing with plain physical, practical issues. Plain practical issues, some with highly philosophical, metaphysical, and ontological problems, but they all claim to derive their authority from the utterances of Buddha himself. And indeed, they are all variations of the same basic containment in the Four Noble Truths, Buddha's first sermon. Furthermore, the origin of the different and often controversial aspects of the doctrine is to be found in the very approach Sakyamuni Buddha used in his teachings, the only aim of which was to show human beings the way to emancipation from suffering, that is, liberation. Since suffering is a basic fact of life, the goal is common to all, but the roads to its elimination are many. To quote the view on this issue of a contemporary Tibetan Lama, quote, "A major characteristic of all Buddhist teachings is that they are designed to fit the needs and aptitudes of each individual. Since we all have different interests, problems, and ways of life, no one method of instruction could ever be suitable for everyone. Buddha himself explained that for the purpose of reaching a particular discipline, coming from a particular background, he would teach a particular doctrine. Thus there could be certain times when it might be necessary to say yes, and others when it might be even more appropriate to say no, even in response to the same question." End of quote. This precisely is the strength of Buddhism, namely, the flexibility of its methods and practices, its emphasis on each individual's experience, not intellectual, philosophical knowledge alone, or blind faith. Nothing, no method is excluded that could lead to the ultimate goal of liberation. This endows the teaching with an exquisite ability to adapt to the conditions of various people living under different geographical climates, different cultures, historical backgrounds. In this sense, Buddhism has truly a universal character and a relevance to life that has persisted undiminished to this day, for its wisdom is rooted in the depth of the human psyche. With such a wide latitude in matters of instruction and practice, it was inevitable that during the ensuing centuries after Buddha's death, doctrinal differences would emerge and a variety of traditions develop. 2 major systems arose: Hinayana, or the lesser vehicle, and Mahayana, or the greater vehicle. The former, the southern school, spread in the countries today known as Burma, Thailand, and Sri Lanka, and the latter, the northern school, includes the geographical areas of northern India, Mongolia, Tibet, Sikkim, Bhutan, Nepal, Cambodia, Vietnam, China, Korea, and Japan. The Hinayana stresses strict moral regulations and adherence to austere rules of conduct. The ultimate goal is attainment of one's own salvation. The highest stage of individual development, the ideal human being, is called an arhat. The word means a slayer of the foe, and the foe is understood to be the passions. The Mahayana continues where Himalayas left off. The ultimate goal of Mahayanists is to seek salvation not for their own sake, but for the benefit of all beings. And this goal is no less than the attainment of Buddhahood. While Hinayana emphasizes austerity, self-reliance, and high ethical behavior, Mahayana emphasizes intuitive wisdom to remove the veil of ignorance obscuring our own pure essence, the Buddha nature dwelling in all of us, which only needs to be uncovered. To find one's true self, realize oneself, is to realize the inherent Buddha nature. It has been said that the Hinayana emphasizes the humanity of the Buddha, the Mahayana emphasizes the Buddha nature of humanity. The ideal of the Arhat in Hinayana is replaced by the Mahayana system by the ideal of the Bodhisattva. From the ideal of the purely private salvation of Arhats intent upon realizing nirvana, Bodhisattvas have vowed to devote all their pursuits to the welfare of others, and to work for a universal deliverance of all beings. In them, any self-seeking egoistic action and endeavors are totally absent. Here's a quote, "Gentle and not abusive, without deceit and fraud, full of love towards all beings, so is a Bodhisattva." End quote. The word Bodhisattva has been defined as meaning heroic being, spiritual warrior, or illuminated heart and valiant one. Bodhisattvas, gentle and not abusive, react spontaneously to their impulse of compassion towards everyone and all, and are fully involved in the affairs of the world. They are in the midst of it, with all the struggles and tribulations. Theirs is not a negative way of denying and abandoning the word, but a positive way of affirming it and transforming it by virtue of their great compassion and great wisdom. Their life task is to set people free from ignorance, passion, and evil. Bodhisattvas have made the indestructible resolution to become a Buddha solely for the benefit of others, and they have thus single-mindedly entered and are pursuing the way of the enlightened being to become fully integrated, free from confusion and inner conflict. They have developed the means to tap their inner treasures of others. They have developed the means to tap the inner treasures of others, the latent seeds of enlightenment, which, according to Mahayana, is the common heritage of humanity. They are, quote, like the skilled alchemist who, by virtue of the powers of his chemicals, can change silver into gold and gold into silver, unquote. One naturally wonders and asks, what is it that gives the Bodhisattva the strength by which he excels all the rest? Is it his capacity to sustain the comprehension of the true nature of things, his capacity to bear with every circumstance devoid of fear and anxiety, and his ability to meet every situation with unimpeded insight and unbounded compassion? I'm sorry, that's the answer. It is his capacity to sustain the comprehension of the nature of things, his capacity to bear with circumstances devoid of fear and anxiety, to bear every circumstance, and his ability to meet every situation with unimpeded insight and unbounded compassion. Sorry about that. I have frequently asked myself that same question while in the presence of Tibetan lamas, some of whom, I have not the slightest doubt, have attained the stage of Bodhisattva. And I have also pondered over the exquisite ability with which they are capable of affecting the minds and lives of many Westerners, whose historical and cultural background and lifestyles are so vastly different from those of people born and raised in Tibet. Perhaps part of the answer lies in the following description of the Bodhisattva. From the very outset he seeks to realize the wisdom that constitutes Buddhahood, viz., the knowledge of all forms, the knowledge of all the ways of all beings. This is what gives the Buddhas and the advanced Bodhisattvas the ability to keep themselves en rapport with every situation and render help to each individual in a way suited to him or her. Tibetan Buddhism. Tibetan Buddhism is part of Mahayana. When it was introduced into Tibet from India in the 7th century AD, it met with the native Hmong religion and its shamanistic practices. As Buddhism spread, many Indian scholars came to Tibet and translated religious texts and their commentaries until Tibetans themselves began writing their own commentaries. It has been said that on the Tibetan soil, Buddhism mixed with the local Bon cult and incorporated some of its features. The present Dalai Lama, however, denies any extraneous influences and states that the Buddhist teachings that spread to Tibet is just the stainless teachings of India and nothing else. The Tibetan Lamas neither altered it nor mixed it with other religion. In the course of time, 4 major schools arose: the Nyingma, the Karma, the Sakya, and the Gilag. Pronunciation all wrong, I'm sorry. Each of these schools traces its lineage to different Indian scholars, and consequently presents variations in the mode of instructions, but Tibetans emphasize that there are no fundamental differences in their philosophy and spiritual practices. All are in quest of the same goal, enlightenment. In fact, all adhere to the teachings of both Hinayana and Mahayana, and also Tantrayana, a division of Mahayana. Yana is the Sanskrit word for vehicle. A contemporary Lama, in his own lectures, equated this vehicle to a path or an elevator to lift up our consciousness to enlightenment. There are three principal aspects to the path of enlightenment: the spiritual journey, renunciation, the enlightenment motive, and the correct view of reality. Blended together, they are like the fuel propelling our rocket to the moon of enlightenment. I shall now try to outline them very briefly. Before entering the path, individuals and all their actions are motivated only by egoic desires to acquire wealth, power, fame, etc., to have pleasure and escape from pain. But little do they know that the scramble for wealth, power, or any worldly desire can never bring satisfaction. This pursuit is what Buddhists call the condition or samsara, a Sanskrit term meaning circling. In this life it refers to our ingrained strong habit of going round and round in circles, chasing after gratification of desires, pleasures of one sort or another, which are invariably eluding us. The perpetuum mobile of mundane life, moving from one situation to another, fluctuating from one mood to another, desiring an object, acquiring and tasting it, becoming saturated, frustrated, discarding it, and turning around to start the very same process again and again. We never reach the sought-after goal, for the very characteristic of samsara is dissatisfaction, suffering. The term samsara applies to the cyclic existence of continuous rebirths, out of which there is no escape until liberation, that is nirvana. In that sense, samsara means the round of existence. According to Buddhist thought, the source of samsara is ignorance, that is, unawareness, going about in response to the promptings of hedonistic impulses, an unconscious, undisciplined, uncontrolled, and scattered mind. Another kind of ignorance is our delusion that phenomena are permanent, whereas impermanence, change, is the ubiquitous law of nature. We are attached to people, objects, possessions, situations, and above all our own body and life, and when they change or cease to be, we experience suffering. Nurtured by the desire for permanence and non-change, one's mind becomes stiff and frozen. Our greatest enemy is our selfishness, or, as Buddhists say, ego-grasping, our self-cherishing attitude. All suffering derives from it. The three poisons of the mind, greed, and hatred, greed, hatred, and ignorance, pollute our thoughts and actions and bring us confusion, restlessness, and pain. As we scrutinize our own experiences, we find out that with our actions, conscious or unconscious, whether motivated by positive or negative thoughts, we plant seeds that will ripen in the future. Buddhists would say we will suffer or benefit from the consequence in future lives, but also very much so in this life, indeed in our immediate future. This is the simple and inextricable law of the cause of an effect, karma, the actions which inevitably produce future, if not immediate, suffering and harm to others or ourselves, are called non-virtuous, unskillful, or negative actions, while those which produce positive results are called virtuous actions. As Buddhists repeatedly tell us, all beings, without exception, share in common the desire to avoid suffering and achieve happiness. Yet through our thoughts and actions, and due to our deluded and polluted minds, we bring ourselves to the exact opposite of what we strive for. For Buddhists, sins are called non-virtuous actions, but by virtue they mean not only goodness and morality, but also efficacy, power, which virtuous actions indeed are capable of generating. Greed, pride, anger, and the like, then, are non-virtuous actions, which lead to mental suffering and confusion. As human beings, we have the precious opportunity and infinite possibilities to activate higher tendencies and plant virtuous seeds that lead to spiritual growth and ultimately liberation. It all depends on our minds. When we have hit bottom and have become disgusted with our misery, our endless samsaric turmoil, we reach a renounced mind. Here's a quote, "The gateway to all spiritual path, whether leading to personal liberation or supreme enlightenment, is a fully renounced mind. Just as a passport, visa, vaccination, or sufficient money are necessary before we can undertake a long journey, so also is the state of mind essential if we are to follow the Dharma successfully. What exactly does such a mind renounce? We must develop renunciation into the causes of suffering and the mental afflictions themselves. Renunciation does not imply that we should give up our enjoyments or possessions. There have been many highly realized beings who have been kings, wealthy merchants, and the like. It is not our possessions, but our ignorant, clinging attitude towards them that must be abandoned." End of quote. It needs to be emphasized that, contrary to popular belief, what the mind renounces is suffering, samsara, or miserable alienated way of life, the existential despair, or to put it differently, it renounces unconsciousness, darkness of the mind, and the mind that is not awakened. When the mind is conscious, awakened, then samsara is no more, and there is no dissatisfaction. Indeed, the word Buddha simply means that, the awakened one. The mind has the potential to be awakened. In fact, it has an urge to awake, yet it sleeps in ignorance and delusion. When unobstructed by ignorance, it experiences peace and bliss. Some, if not most people, have such experiences in at least a few rare times in their lives: genuine love, aesthetic experience, encounters with extraordinary human beings, altered states of consciousness. These are brief, fleeting moments when we have glimpses of another state of mind, another level of existence, and a recognition that there is within our power to attain it here and now. We also come to realize that it is not the external environment, but our mind, our inner world, that adjudicates over our happiness or suffering. This is like finding a wish-filled jewel. But the fully renounced mind in itself is not sufficient to achieve full enlightenment, according to the Mahayana school, which consistently stresses that any action must be motivated by the intention to benefit others and not merely oneself. Thus, the concept of renounced mind must be added. Thus, to the concept of the renounced mind must be added the mind of enlightenment, the enlightenment motive, or the bodhisattva, which constitutes the second of the three principal aspects of the path of enlightenment. With the awakening of the mind of enlightenment, one becomes vitally interested in the welfare of other beings. In fact, Tibetan Buddhists always refer to all sentient beings, not only humankind. Like oneself, all sentient beings are afflicted by suffering. Thus, even the smallest insect is perhaps to oneself in not wanting suffering and wanting happiness. So the smallest insect is similar to oneself in not wanting suffering and wanting happiness. From the awareness of the interior states of mind, consciousness and unconsciousness, and the law of cause and effect that determines them, one reaches to expanded awareness that includes others. From ego involvement, self-cherishing attitude focusing solely on one's own being, one moves on to another level where one perceives the advantages and necessities to cherish others. Here too the law of cause and effect reigns supreme. From close interpersonal relationships to social and international relations, the roots of all conflicts and wars lie in the self-cherishing attitudes, virtuous actions towards others, in body, speech, and mind, such as refraining from killing, stealing, lying, using harsh language, and developing compassion and generosity, bring genuine and lasting pleasure and satisfaction. These actions, free from egocentricity, have an energizing effect on the person who performs them, and paradoxically, by losing one's ego in a selfless activity, one finds one's self, capital S self. The effects can be easily checked. These are the best moments in anyone's life. Again, they are found in the presence of works of art of any kind, which is precisely the function of art, in true communication with another human being, in creative activity. They are found even in small, simple aspects of everyday life, whenever one steps out of one's self-imposed, egocentric prison. The enlightenment motive moves one first to be concerned with the suffering of others, and as a next step to develop a strong motivation to attain enlightenment for the sake of others. That is to guide them to liberation. This is the way of the Buddhavista who knows that the only way to inspire, assist, and guide others to liberation is to have first followed the path of self and attained enlightenment. But even before one has made that determination, every action that has been touched by the mind of enlightenment, bodhicitta, even the smallest, most mundane action, becomes powerful. Thus, it is said that giving a handful of food to a dog, if done with bodhicitta, brings us more benefit than giving of a universe of jewels to every living being without such motivation. The enlightened motive is like the art of the alchemist that changes base metal into gold. The third of the three principal aspects of the path to enlightenment is the correct view of reality, or the wisdom of voidness, sunyata. This is the most difficult concept to comprehend, and it must be grasped through direct experience, not merely through intellectual understanding. Yet it is the heart of all Buddhist teachings and inseparable from the other two principal aspects of the path discussed earlier. It cannot be explained and understood through rational analysis, but only through gradual development of intuitive wisdom. The training to this higher, or in this higher wisdom, is essentially because misconceptions about reality are the basic source of all suffering. Quote here. The ego's misconceptions about reality keep us in bondage, whether it be the iron bondage of worldly existence or the golden bondage of spiritual way of life. The iron bondage is our continual mental and physical suffering in the cycle of dissatisfied existence known as samsara, while the golden bondage is that of being enslaved to misconceptions and false prophecies. The highest goal is to be free of all bondage. End quote. The concept of sanyata, emptiness, has given rise to much misinterpretation and distortion. Sunya, a Sanskrit word, means relating to the swollen. According to the Buddhist scholar Edward Conze, the etymology of the word expresses the unity of opposites, namely, what is swollen from the outside is hollow inside. Our personality is both swollen by the five skandhas and the empty of self. There is no independent, inherently existent, unrelated self, an I, as we have been accustomed to think. The nature of all phenomena is emptiness. Philosophically, this is the principle of relativity of all things and conditions, but it is also the principle of limitless potentiality, non-exclusiveness. Emptiness can contain and produce everything. A synonym for sanyata is non-duality. On this subject, the Lakavantara Sutra says, quote, "What is meant by non-duality? It means that light and shade, long and short, black and white, are relative terms, and not independent of each other. As nirvana and samsara are, all things are not too. There is no nirvana except there is samsara. There is no samsara except there is nirvana. For the condition of existence is not of mutually exclusive nature." Unquote. The lack of separate, permanent I does not imply its total non-existence, which would be nihilism. Another extreme and dogmatic viewpoint, equally wrong. Thus, there is a conventional I, which we all have, that exists on the relative level of reality, while on the ultimate absolute level of reality it does not exist. The existence of the five skandhas is conventional truth, while the void nature of all phenomena is absolute truth. This distinction between the relative, mundane, and absolute ultimate truth is central to the philosophy of Madhyamika, the middle way, which I shall return to in a later chapter. According to the present Dalai Lama, it is a theory which remains supreme among all the theories of different Buddhist scholars. At this point, it is important to emphasize again the Buddhist view that the misconception about reality and the belief in an independent, fixed existence of the self is the source of all suffering, and that realization of sanyata is like the knife that cuts the root of ignorance. Tantric Buddhism, Vajrayana. With Tantric Buddhism, or Vajrayana, the third vehicle, although part of the Mahayana school, Tibetan Buddhism reaches its highest and most magnificent development. By following the short path of Tantra, also known as the Diamond Vehicle, The adept may reach enlightenment in one single lifetime, while according to Buddhist thought, all other graded paths take an extraordinarily long time, aeon upon aeon, to attain Buddhahood. Tantra, a Sanskrit word, relates to the concept of weaving, suggesting activity, continuity, and also interdependence and interrelatedness. Tantric Buddhism is based on the philosophy of Madhyamika, which is essentially the concept of the middle way, the view free of the two extremes, externalism and nihilism. It is interested neither in theoretical and metaphysical speculations nor in the aesthetic practices of some sects. Its emphasis is on the method, on activity and continuity. The methods are complex, at times bewildering, strange, and incomprehensible to the uninitiated, suggestive of primitive superstitions and shamanistic magic. Yet, in their essence, they are all but different methods of spiritual transformation, ways of transmuting any and all aspects of samsaric life, positive, negative, and neutral, into transcendental wisdom. All obstacles, negativities, passions are harnessed and transmuted into into vehicles on the path to enlightenment. Good and evil are transcended and flow back into pure spiritual essence, which is the ultimate nature of the universe. This is the direct, short path to liberation, the most powerful one, as it entails a radical revolution of consciousness, but is by no means an easy path, nor devoid of dangers. It is far from being primitive in the negative sense of the term. Quite to the contrary, it is a most sophisticated method of spiritual growth and transformation. Mircea Eliade points out that there are parallels between, quote, Tantrism and Great Western Mystiosophic current that, at the beginning of the Christian era, arose from the confluence of Gnosticism, Hermeticism, Greco-Egyptian alchemy, and the traditions of the mysteries. End of quote. The goal is the same as in all other schools of Buddhism, namely enlightenment, but it is enlightenment here and now and not in the inconceivable future. It aims at the permanent destruction of suffering, the sole concern of Buddha, as expressed in his very sermon on the Four Noble Truths, and follows the conviction that there is an alternative in this existence to the misery of mundane life. It is important to note that before entering the tantric path, the adept must be familiar with and practice at all times the fundamental steps of the Hinayana and the Mahayana schools: restraint, self-awareness, training of the mind, compassion, and cultivation of wisdom are necessary foundations before one ventures into the diamond path. In fact, a tantric master of the 11th century, Attisa, based his teachings on the idea that Hinayana, Mahayana, and Vajrayana could not be regarded separately but must be seen as aspects of the single path. Looking at the three yanas together, they are a consistent and natural evolution in Buddhist theory and practice. Tantric implies continuity, the continuity of the movement of one's life and inner growth when spiritual practice is conscientiously pursued. And practice leads to an understanding of the interwovenness of all phenomena, the relationship between microcosm and macrocosm, mind and universe, matter and spirit, an idea that bears a striking similarity to the findings of some modern science. It could be said that the aim of Buddhist Tantra is to penetrate into, harness, and transform the dynamic forces of the universe, which are no different from the psychological forces and archetypical constellations of our own psyche. But this cannot be done through the exercise of discursive thought or application of abstract theories, but only by being deeply immersed in actual practice. Due to the enormous wealth of those practices, Tantra has given rise to much misunderstanding and misconception. In the Western world, it has often been equated with magic and exotic sexual practices. As to the origins of the Tantra, as well as the similarity or differences between Hindu and Buddhist Tantras, there is much controversy and no definitive agreement on these issues. According to one author, there was no one particular person who introduced Tantra into Buddhism at any particular time, but rather it has been gradually incorporated in the course of centuries. The same author maintains that there are no fundamental differences between Hindu and Buddhist Tantras. Other scholars, by contrast, such as Lama Govinda and Ben Yotash Bhattacharya maintain that Tantric Buddhism is not an offspring of Tantric Hinduism as claimed by some. It was crystallized into a definitive form by the 3rd century AD. Both scholars affirm that despite outward appearance of similarity between the two systems, there are fundamental differences. The main difference, according to Lama Govinda, lies in the concept of sakti, the active power, and the creative feminine active aspect of Siva, the highest god. This aspect is not entered into the system of Tantric Buddhism. In the latter, the central idea is not sakti, power, but pranja, knowledge, intuitive wisdom. It would be hard to differentiate wisdom and power in the context of Vajrayana. Wisdom ultimately is power, albeit not the power of the sword, but the force capable of effecting transformation. And Buddhists repeatedly talk about the power of the mind. These issues may not be of major significance as far as the practice of Vajrayana is concerned. However, since there is considerable confusion on this point, it is important to be aware of them and to recognize the proper distinctions as well as the equivalence between the two tantric systems. The polarity of male and female principles is a basic Vajrayana concept. Their union is the goal of all tantric practices. Through this union of opposites, all duality is transcended into an ultimate unity. This is the highest spiritual reality in the path to enlightenment. In fact, it is enlightenment itself. In Buddhist iconography, the principle of union is represented by deities and their consorts in an ecstatic embrace, enjoying great bliss. Quote, according to all schools of Tantra, bliss is the nature of the Absolute. The Absolute is realized by us when we realize ourselves as perfect bliss. In all our ordinary experiences of pleasure, we have but a momentary glimpse of the same bliss as constitutes the ultimate nature of our self. But these experiences of pleasure, because of their extreme limited and defiled nature, bind us to a lower plane of life, instead of contributing to our advancement towards self-realization. End quote. Bliss, nirvana, enlightenment become synonymous in Tantric Buddhism, the total immersion of the ultimate nature of the self and the not-self in the oneness of the perfect bliss. The sexo-yogic spiritual practices, the erotic mysticism, so much misunderstood in the West, are based on that principle when sexual bliss becomes divine bliss and the instrument for highest spiritual attainment. Buddhist Tantra holds that the human body is the microcosm that embodies the truth of the macrocosm. Absolute reality contains all dualities and polarities. Noumen and phenomenon, potentiality and manifestation, nirvana and samsara, prajna, wisdom, female principle, and upaya, method to attain wisdom, male principle, sunya, void, and karuna, compassion. Within their own bodies, Tantric disciples achieve the reunion of the two polar principles, that is, the primordial unity which excludes all discrimination and includes all differentiations. Or, in other words, through the medium of their bodies, they transcend the mundane, phenomenal world and experience non-duality, the completeness preceding all creation, the great bliss. All tantric practices, rituals, and meditations, the so-called sadhanas, have their aim in this realization. This is the dialectic of opposites, the theme of the Madhyamika philosophy, the middle way, that encompasses and embraces all. But Tantric disciples are more concerned with direct knowledge of that state achieved in the actuality of their practice. Quote, right in the moment when the great compassion arises, emerges nakedly and vividly the great voidness. Let me always find the unmistakable two in one path and practice it day and night. End quote. The Tibetan Buddhist symbol of the two in one is Yab Yum, the father-mother divine couple in embrace, seen repeatedly in Tibetan sacred art, which both inspires and expresses visually the experiences and visions of meditation. Lama Govinda states that in these symbols there is no association whatever with physical sexuality. They portray only the union of male and female principles. The external female qualities, as those of the Divine Mother, are transcendent wisdom. Instead of seeking union with a woman outside ourselves, we have to seek it within ourselves by the union of our male and female nature in the process of meditation. Lama Govinda holds the view that sexual polarity has to be recognized as a mere incident of universal polarity and has to be overcome. Quote, only if we are able to see the relationship of body and mind, of physical and spiritual interaction in a universal perspective, and if in this way we overcome the I and mine and the whole structure of egocentric feelings, opinions, and prejudices, which produce the illusion of our separate individuality, and then only can we rise to the sphere of Buddhahood. End of quote. Nevertheless, conjugal intercourse, Maithuna, has been practiced by Tantric Buddhists as a sacred ritual based on the same concept of the union of male and female principles. S.B. Dasgupta examines the argument of the Tantric Buddhists in defense of their unconventional practices of Maithuna. They emphasize that everything depends on the purity of the mind. Actions motivated by and done with wisdom and compassion, with a pure mind, cannot but be pure. But they also warn that it is a very dangerous path for the uninitiated. That which drags the uninitiated fool to the hell of debauchery may help the initiated yogin to attain enlightenment. Unquote. The vital point is the adherence of the yogi and the yogini in their vow to perform any action with a compassionate mind and with wisdom, that is, the knowledge and understanding of the void nature of all phenomena. So it is said that, quote, as some medicine is sweet to taste and at the same time cures disease, so also is the bliss coming out of the combination of prajna, wisdom, and upaya, compassion. It destroys the afflictions easily and smoothly. Again, what to one is a rope for hanging oneself is a remover of bondage to the other. Unquote. Another scholar, Herbert Gunther, similarly argues in favor of pleasure as being a life-enhancing state. Quote, we may use such phrases as ecstatic bliss or great bliss to refer to the sense of freedom from the impoverishment brought about by egocentredness. Unquote. Here is how some of the Tantric texts speak of the subject of bliss. Quote, the all-Buddha awareness which is experienced within ourselves is called great bliss because it is the most excellent pleasure of all pleasures. Without bliss there is no enlightenment, for enlightenment is bliss itself. Just as in the deep darkness the moonstone spreads its light, so this great supreme great bliss in a moment dissipates all misery. Unquote. However, this is by no means hedonism. Quite to the contrary, it requires extraordinary discipline, and it is only through consistent discipline that true freedom is acquired. On the path towards freedom, any passion and desire must be utilized and transformed into wisdom. This is the very basic principle of any tantric practice. In this respect, it is similar to homeopathy, working on the principle that like cures like. The very element that causes a disease, if applied to a proper dose, may act as an antidote and cure the disease. Quote, the Vajrayanist will always say that the very action which binds a man down to the world of infinite misery may help him attain liberation, if taken from a different perspective, i.e., if taken with a knowledge of the prajna and the upaya. End quote. As in homeopathic medicine, symptoms are not suppressed but rather caused to exacerbate temporarily as a necessary step towards their complete elimination. Thus, anger is cured with anger, desire with desire, and so on, when transmuted into wisdom. But we are dealing here with a double-edged sword. The way may lead to elimination or pathology. For this reason, the path cannot be followed without the guidance of a qualified, compassionate teacher who himself has attained wisdom. This is also the reason why the teachings and the actual practices have been kept secret. To achieve the desired effect and value, they can be transmitted only through a highly developed teacher under proper circumstances. But in fact, they are bound to remain secret to the uninitiated, for, like any esoteric teachings, they can be communicated only gradually and to the extent that one is ready to receive them, or rather discover them for oneself. In the process of transformation and the achievement of higher states of consciousness, numerous aids were used, and a great variety of worship and rituals practiced. They are all designed to involve totally the three spheres of our being, that is, body, speech, and mind. Their purpose is to activate and conjure up powerful but dormant forces from the deep levels of the unconscious. It is a confrontation with our innermost nature to awaken us. The three basic and prevalent methods are recitation of the mantras, sacred words involving the speech, performance of ritual gestures and mudras involving the body, meditation, especially visualization of and identification with deities involving the mind. I shall return to these methods in subsequent chapter and discuss them and their meaning in more detail, as well as the symbolism and function of mandalas. At this point, it may suffice to state that, quote, the aim of all tantras is to teach the ways whereby we may set free the divine light, which is mysteriously present and shining in each of us, although it is enveloped in an insidious web of the psyche's weaving. Reader's commentary. So I'm very interested to read this book because it looks at what Jung talks about and then Buddhism, bringing them together. If you read or listened to me read Wilber's No Boundaries, you saw how Wilber was able to diagnose the differences between psychology and Jung, thereby, and Buddhism, into addressing different aspects of who we are, our ego on one level and then universalism on the other level. Whereas this writer is bringing these two different ways together, which I think is more in line with my understanding of what Jung was all about and where Buddhism is going. I read this first chapter with great interest. I was interested to see how she would synopsize Buddhism in just a few pages, and she did a pretty good job. That said, I don't really know anything about Tantric Buddhism except what she wrote about, which is that it it's sort of a kind of, from my understanding, sort of a creepy way of bringing sexuality into religion. I don't buy what she says about how it's like this secret rite and you have to like know this teacher to be able to get to understand it. I think um, that what Campbell said about keep your images transparent to the you know to the transformative, or whatever it was, the exact quote, is really important. And I think that that's to the teachings too, that when you have these secret teachings, that there's a great deal of doubt and skepticism on my part, particularly from a quite sexist tradition and society when it involves sex. So it's interesting that this woman is writing about this author, and that she's writing it from sort of it feels like a reactive, defensive position, which makes me wonder what happened to her. So I'll keep reading. We'll see what happens in this book. Chapter 2, C. G. Jung. 2.5 millennia after Buddha and about a century ago, on the other side of the globe from India, Carl Gustav Jung was born. He was born and lived his entire life in Switzerland, in that lovely, peaceful country in the heart of Europe and the Western world, a country which has known no wars for many, many years. His parents and ancestors on both sides were traditional people, deeply rooted in the Swiss soil and customs which endure and tolerate no change. He loved his country, but since early age he felt that its beauty belonged to a space and a time that was far transcended the narrow boundaries of that tiny nation and its immovable society. His very first memories, first initiation of something larger than himself, were memories of wonder as he stood in awesome contemplation of the blue waters of Lake Constance and the white snow-covered peaks of the majestic Alps. Already then he had a sense that there was the center of that this was the center of the universe, but not the universe of his parents and a few million Swiss, but of a very private universe within himself, which he saw mirrored in the quiet waters of the lake, and extending to the peaks of the Alps and beyond into infinity. He grew up as a shy, sensitive boy, often at odds with his parents' beliefs and his teachers' demands. He felt both very special and at times inadequate in schools in comparison to his classmates. He was easily hurt and was prone to outbursts of rage when injustice was done to him, when, for example, his teacher accused him of cheating. But it was in such moments that he sought and found refuge in his personality. Number two, as he called it. The personality was his true authentic self, reaching deep into the roots of mankind itself, perhaps even before mankind was. Quote, somewhere deep in the background, I always knew that I was two persons. One was the son of my parents, who went to school and led, and was less intelligent, attractive, hard-working, decent, and clean than many other boys. The other was grown up, old in fact, skeptical, mistrustful, remote from the world of men, but close to nature, the earth, the sun, the moon, the weather, all living creatures, and above all close to the night, to dreams, and to whatever God worked directly within him. Quote, end quote. This other was a frail personality that often eluded him, and so he had to push forward with his so-called personality number one, a sham, a game, that gradually more and more satisfied all around him except his own self. So he continued his path, going from one success to another. Whatever he worked at, he accomplished with flying colors. But the turmoil inside never left him, and was a constant prodder that led him astray from where everyone around him expected him to go. While his personality number one was brilliant, his personality number two was aching with pain, the pain of unfulfilled wholeness. He searched for that wholeness all his life. He heard of a professor in Vienna. He went to see the professor and paid his respect to him, as he mistook him for a genius who was not understood by others. They became close friends and associates. Jung's personality number two, however, rebelled at the very instant of their first encounter, but he refused to heed his personality number two, which was still weak and submerged at the time. The professor in Vienna became famous, and as his fame grew, their friendship dwindled. Only later Jung understood. It was not their friendship that dwindled, it was his personality number two that became an individual in his own right. The professor from Vienna and Jung parted. This was the greatest shock in his life. It threw him into darkness, such as he had never known before, but out of all of it, his entire work emerged. He had left behind not only his friend from Vienna, to whom he nevertheless always remained grateful, but also his personality number one. From then on, Jung devoted himself fully to his personality number two. Many people from all the corners of the world came to see him and inspired him, and he inspired them. Alone in his stone tower, he was in deep and intimate contact with everything and everyone that was at that time, that preceded him, that would follow him. On a stormy day late in spring, at the age of 85, his long and rich life came to an end. His personality number one finally left him for good. Let his personality number two goes on living, for there was no time when it was not, and there will be no time when it will cease to be. Quote, my life has been, in a sense, the quintessence of what I have written, end quote, says C.G. Jung in the introduction to his autobiography. So his entire life, his myth, should be viewed as an indivisible whole, that proceeded as a gradual and continuous unfoldment out of its own unique seed. No event, no aspect of his outer or inner life are unimportant or irrelevant to his work. Quote, my life is what I have done, my scientific work. The one is inseparable from the other. The work is the expression of my inner development, for commitment to the contents of the unconscious forms the man and produces his transformation. My works can be regarded as stations along life's way. Unquote. There was a particularly pregnant time in Jung's life when new ideas were germinating, which were later to occupy him for the rest of his life. This was the period following his break with Freud. For a while, he lost his bearings. It was a time of confusion, turmoil, isolation, loneliness, of inner chaos. Jung was assailed with confusing dreams, images, visions, and a surge of unconscious material that at times made him doubt his own sanity. And indeed, in a sense, it was not unlike a psychotic break. But it was also a crucial intersection, a most creative station along his life's way. These were the years of Jung's confrontation with his unconscious. Here the vision of the young Siddhartha Gautama comes to mind. The well-protected innocent prince, suddenly shocked by the sights of the tragic sides of life, sickness, old age, and death. His determination to find answers to the riddle of life, first unsuccessfully from learned men, and finally from within himself, in deep meditation under the Bodhi tree. Similarly, Jung could not find answers to his questions either from Freud or anyone else or any books or theories, and so, like Siddhartha, he left behind all of them to look for answers within his own psyche. In his autobiography, Jung tells us he had to undergo the original experience himself. One day he sat at his desk, let himself drop, plunged into the depth of his psyche, submitting to the spontaneous impulses of his unconscious. This was the very beginning of an experiment which lasted for several years and produced a wealth of material, later to become part of Jung's most important works, his most creative contributions. Throughout that time, he not only observed carefully, but wrote down and embellished with great drawings his dreams, fantasies, and visions, and they all became part of his famous Red Book. But being trained as a scientist, he felt the obligation to understand the meaning of all that material. Quote, I had to draw concentric conclusions from the insights the unconscious had given me, and that task was to become a life's work. He had to show that his very personal, subjective experiences were potential experiences of all humankind, for they were an inherent part of the nature of the psyche. It was, though, a revolutionary way in scientific methodology, a new way of seeing things. Above all, Jung had to prove that his own experiences were real, which others could have too, that the unconscious was a demonstrable psychic reality, but which had its own style and spoke its own language, namely the universal language of images and symbols. Furthermore, Jung became aware that the insights gained from the unconscious must be translated into ethical obligation. Quote, not to do so is to fall prey to the power principle. This produces dangerous effects, which are destructive not only to others but even to the knower. The images of the unconscious place a great responsibility upon a man. Failure to understand them, or a shrinking of ethical responsibility, deprives him of his wholeness and imposes a painful fragmentariness on his life. End quote. This thought is reminiscent of Buddhist ethics and enunciated in the Eightfold Path, that is, right action and right meditation. Personal suffering cannot be eliminated, and individual wholeness achieved when ethical conduct is not observed. Jung understood, as Buddha pointed out long ago, that mere egocentric pursuits and disregard of others led to confusion. Thus, knowledge acquired through contact with the unconscious through right meditation, in order to have any significance, must become an integral part of one's life. It must be translated into right action. After about 6 years of fierce struggle with the darkness of his unconscious, Jung began to have the first inklings of light. The dawn appeared when he started sketching mandalas, one new mandala a day. A mandala, which is the Sanskrit word for circle, is a circular pattern form found in all elements of nature and in the arts and dances of all people throughout history. It is also an image residing in the depths of human psyche, which spontaneously emerges and assumes many forms. It usually takes shape in times of disorganization and inner chaos, and it is nature's way of restoring balance and order. Jung discovered through his own experience that each single mandala he drew was an expression of his inner state of being at the particular time. As his psychic state changed, so did the mandala he would spontaneously sketch. He came to the conclusion that the mandala represented formation, transformation, eternal mind, eternal recreation. At the same time, he realized that the efforts he pursued consciously prompted so to At the same time, he realized that the efforts he proved consciously, prompted so to speak by his personality number one, were undermined by a stronger force which compelled him to take a different path. In other words, he could not choose a goal, rather it chose him. Quote, I had to let myself be carried along by the current, without notation of where it would lead me. When I began drawing the mandalas, however, I saw that everything, all paths I had been following, all the steps I had taken, were leading back to the single point, namely, the midpoint. It became increasingly plain to me that the mandala is a center. It is the exponent of all paths. It is the path to the center, to individuation. End quote. Thus, the forceful and persistent question in his mind was answered. The question as to what this process is all about and what the destination is. The goal was the self, big S, the alpha and omega of psychic development, for the big S self is the proto-image out of which the person emerges and the culmination of his growth. And then Jung had a dream, which was both symbolic of a situation at the time, darkness and isolation, but also emerging vision of light and flowering of new life. And through its elaborate imagery, unmistakably pointed to the center, the big S self, as the goal. Quote, through this dream, I understood that the big S self is the principle and archetype of orientation and meaning. Therein lies its healing function. For me, this insight signified an approach to the center and therefore to the goal. Out of this emerged a first inkling of my personal myth. Unquote. This was an event of tremendous importance, a turning point in Jung's life and his work. It was the climax of his confrontation of the unconscious, his 6 years of solitary battle with the dark depths of the psyche. Jung describes these years as, quote, the most important in my life. In them everything essential was decided. It all began then. The later details are only supplements and clarifications of the material that burst forth from unconscious. And it first swamped me. It was a prima matera for a life's work. It was during these years that he made the discovery of the collective unconscious and developed the concepts of the archetypes and the self. But much work still lay ahead for him. All the fantasies and material that had flooded him from the unconscious and the insights he gained needed to be built on a solid foundation of scientific theory. That work gradually unfolded as Jung encountered alchemy. In alchemy, he discovered that, unlike in Christianity, the feminine principle is as important as the masculine. The symbols in alchemy, those old acquaintances of Jung, fascinated him. But he began really to understand it after reading a Chinese alchemical text, The Secret of the Golden Flower. This was also probably the beginning of his interest in Oriental philosophies and spiritual traditions. To Jung, quote, the secret of alchemy was in the transformation of personality through the blending and fusion of the noble with the base components, of the conscious with the unconscious, unquote. In alchemy, he found a correspondence to his psychology which gave his work a confirmation of its validity. It was not, however, the end product of Jung's creative journey, for he did not stop with psychology. He went beyond it. Reader's commentary. So we're not done with this chapter. We're going to go into different aspects of Jungian psychology. But I think it's interesting to look at how she's drawing a parallel between Buddha and Jung's life, which to that I would say is everybody's journey. So that the story of Buddha's journey, and then we can look at the story of Jung's journey and the story of anybody's journey of really becoming their complete and integrative, or what Jung would say, reaching full individuation, or what Maslow would say, being fully actualized, is everybody's journey, or what Campbell would say, that the hero's journey. I would just say that it's just being your true self, to really realize all of your true self. Um, I think that one of the things that she's pointing out is when Jung is talking about, the conscious and the unconscious, and we look at our shadow and we start discovering the unconscious. We'll hear more about that. That's similar to what could be thought of as a non-dualistic interpretation of Buddhism when we're looking at, say, for example, anatta, non-self. It does not mean no self. I call it not non-self, so the ego, little e, and then what Jung would say, the big self, big S. Both coexist, that they exist together, and one could not have the experience of non-self without having the egoic self. And then the idea of, we have anicca, I probably pronounced that wrong, but the idea of impermanence. Again, everything is impermanent, and yet you can't experience that without having some concept of, and probably even some desire of permanence, that you don't want things to end, or want death, or don't want death, or whatever that is. And then the third aspect of of Buddhism, of dukkha, or suffering, that there's always something that's dissatisfactory. Well, I think that's something for, in terms of the westernization of Buddhism and interpretation and understanding of it through modern psychology, which, by the way, she talks about how Jung wanted to base this in science, which I think is really funny if we're going to look at it from a historical perspective. At some point, we'll see that science is simply science, and I would also probably say commerce is simply the religion of today. But in any case, when we look at that third piece of dukkha, of that, when we need to, what needs to happen in terms of understanding suffering or unsatisfactoriness or dukkha or whatever you want to call it, and then in a non-dualistic, or even just, I would say, in a Western understanding, that the non-satisfactoriness that we experience today is probably, I would say, quite different than we experienced 2,500 years ago, when the average lifespan was about 30, and uh, death was experienced by everybody everywhere. You had family members. It was not something, life was, for most people, rather brutal. You didn't have the same possibilities for individuation or spiritual path, or whatever you want to call it. So in any case, it's interesting. I think one of the things that might be missing from this interpretation, which is my own personal interest, is how do we look at the westernization of Buddhism through the evolutionary perspective, I think. All right, that's my short, I should say long, commentary on this part of this chapter.